7:32 hours. Steel deck cold under bare soles, binoculars glued to salt-stung eyes. A young Japanese lookout on a destroyer in the outer ring of Yamato's screen marks what he thinks must be the last of them. Lines of dots against a weak, chalky sky. He tries to count 4, 8, 12. Then a darker swarm sliding in from a different bearing, shadows knotted by contrails. The voice on his sound-powered telephone is clipped, polite, betraying its panic only in the speed. Left 10. More high, more high, more high. Someone laughs on the bridge. It is not humor. It's the kind that keeps a throat from closing. The 1st Division passes overhead like a moving warehouse. Warloads tucked under wings. Drop tanks round as kegs. Propeller discs strobing. Avenger torpedo planes squat and purposeful. Helldivers scissor their dive brakes like clenched hands. And between them come the fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs wing, loaded with bombs, then freed to hunt. From the destroyer's bow, the lookout can see Yamato's pagoda mast stack up in the haze, massive and unreal. The sky hums like a transformer. It feels man-made, industrial, a factory floor pressed into the heavens, a harbour in the air. On paper, on every staff board in Tokyo, carriers were jewels, singular, strategic, the capital ships of a new age. Protect them, allocate fuel to them, ration planes for them, debate doctrine for them. In this boy's field of view, that theory evaporates. What comes is not a jewel, but a process. The strikes arrive in pulses, not a singular blow. They come from different directions, at staggered altitudes, with a timing that suggests choreography rather than ambition. When one wave passes, the space it leaves behind does not feel like reprieve. It feels like an aisle between assembly stations. Down below, the crew on the destroyers know. 2 mount loads, the ready-use locker until their backs burn. The gun captain counts seconds between bursts, measuring cycle time. The way a shop foreman listens for the rhythm of a line. Somewhere beyond sight, oilers have snaked hoses to thirsty carriers and passed fuel in a wind-sheared ballet. And armament crews have manhandled 100-pounders into belly racks. You don't see the hose from a destroyer's forecastle, but you hear it in the relentlessness. This sky doesn't run out. The Japanese gunners are good. They have done this under volcano-grey skies off the Philippines and under a cold rain near Formosa. They know how to rake a dive path and how to lay a barrage high, how to guess a torpedo run from a formation's pre-turn separation. But they are fighting not aircraft, not pilots, not even squadrons. They are fighting cycle time. Lookout's eye to glass. He sees something else, a kind of prosaic abundance that insults his training. Carriers were supposed to be rare, the fleet's crown pieces. Here, every new wedge of sky seems to spit airplanes, and every airplane that survives its dive is replaced by 2 more on the next horizon. Then more again behind those. When the radio talks of Task Force 58, the number means little to him. What he can count before counting fails him is the math of arrival. 5 seconds between bombs near the flagship. 20 seconds between the start of one strafing pass and the next. A minute until the next pack of torpedo planes shows their bellies. If he had a slide rule, he could prove it. This is not a battle. It is a throughput problem. On Yamato's bridge, somebody quotes doctrine. The captain answers with course and speed. A staff officer sketches bearings, draw and shoot, trying to decode the logic of the attacks. But the logic isn't tactical geometry. It's logistics. Fuel all night, arm all morning, launch on the 2-minute recover, respot, relaunch. The fast carrier task force has stripped the romance out of decisive battle and replaced it with something more terrifying. Industrial predictability. The lookout tries once more to count, retreating to superstition. If he can fix a number to it, maybe the fear shrinks. He does not know there are fleet carriers in double digits out there, their decks long as city blocks, light carriers knifing along in close escort, and squat little escort carriers, the humble CVEs whose crews call them jeep carriers, pushing out anti-sub patrols and spare squadrons and the bomb hauling, slow but steady muscle that padlocks a perimeter. He does not know the nomenclature CV, CVL, CVE, only the sensation that air has acquired inventory. Bomb splashes walk closer. A helldiver folds into a dive that looks suicidal until its tail flicks and it draws a chalk line down the flank of a cruiser. The lookout's breath hitches as the weapon separates clean, inevitable, and the shock travels up through his calves before sound catches up. He tastes cordite and rust and something else. The metallic bite of disbelief. In another navy, on another sea, a single carrier would have been the sun that battles pivot around. Here, a dozen suns rise and set on a timetable. If one carrier is dinged, a sister rolls to take her slot in the launch cycle. If a squadron is battered, spare planes and spare pilots trained on a schedule, not conjured by heroism, arrive on a baby flat top and are taxied forward like replacement parts. The destroyer's stern shudders as she throws her helm over. Another wave bites at the screen. The lookout has stopped counting. He is not a coward, he is a bookkeeper whose ledger has run out of columns. A thought climbs the spine he's been trying to stiffen. Even if we kill many, the line keeps moving. He imagines, absurdly, a warehouse door rolling up over the Pacific, revealing shelf after shelf of painted decks. On some future night, in a barracks near Cure, someone will explain what happened in terms that make intellectual sense. America did not field carriers. America fielded a carrier ecosystem oilers, ammunition ships, repair ships, training pipelines, radar pickets, code rooms, pilots in depth, planners with clocks instead of sabers. The boy will nod. But here, now, at 7:32, he already knows it in his bones. The sky has become a harbour, and the harbour is full. The myth dies politely, not with a single explosion, not with a duel of flagships, but with a waiting line at a catapult and a chalkboard in a ready room, with the patient tick-tick-tick of a stopwatch in a flag plot. The world has turned. Courage matters. He will see that in the way his shipmates keep their stations. But courage is now an input to a machine whose product is sorties. The future arrived not as a new kind of hero, but as a new kind of math. Start with the letters, because the letters are how navies lie to themselves. CV, the fleet carriers, the big deck queens with the long, flat runway that names a war. CVL, light carriers born of cruiser hulls, nimble and fast enough to keep station with the brutes, hosting trimmed air groups that still bite. CVE, escort carriers, small and boxy, sometimes derided as jeeps, sometimes cursed by destroyer captains who had to wait on their wind, always underestimated by any enemy who measured power only in individual silhouettes. When people argue about 100 carriers by war's end, they stumble on two errors. First, they count like lawyers instead of like sailors. The second, deadlier error is to count ships as if they fight alone. A sailor on the receiving end of a bomb run does not care that the plane lifted off a CV, a CVL, or a CVE. He cares that it lifted off somewhere, and that the launching somewhere will still exist after he shoots this one down. The terror is not the ship class, it is the serial nature of attack, so tally them in the only way that matters. Decks available to launch and recover. By late 1944 and into 1945, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's combat picture includes the Essex-class fleet carriers in growing numbers. The Potter, Independence-class light carriers staged as knife fighters in the task group, and the escort carriers fanning out behind and to the flanks, sewing the ocean shut with anti-submarine patrols, delivering replacement aircraft and standing in as bomb trucks for amphibious assaults. The number that shocks Japanese observers is not written in a staff diary as CV total equals X. It's written in the wake trails and vapor paths. There are always more decks. The escort carrier is the unit that blows up the counting method and, with it, the enemy's war plan. Slower, yes, smaller, yes, but numerous and strategically decisive. When a U.S. amphibious force noses toward a volcanic island, it is the CVEs that turn the approach lane into a covered runway. They launch anti-sub sweeps at dawn, combat air patrol mid-morning, softening strikes before lunch, and close air support all afternoon. They cannot absorb punishment like a fleet carrier. That is not their job. Their job is to turn tomorrow into a guarantee. There will be aircraft on station when the Marines need them, there will be search planes fanning out when the submarines come, and there will be an inbound batch of fresh Hellcats and Avengers when a fleet carrier's air group takes losses. Continuity is the product. The light carrier's CVLs erase the gap between the big deck cycles. Built on cruiser hulls, they sprint. They carry smaller groups, but they carry them fast, giving the task force commander flexibility in tempo. A CVL can be the left hand in a pincer, the reserve for an afternoon push, the nimble knife that predators don't see because they're watching the sword. For pilots, the difference is only in parking and spotting. For Japanese controllers on a coastal radar, the difference is nil. The radar blooms, the blips multiply, and soon the blips resolve into dives and torpedo runs, and the intense, meddling persistence of a fleet that won't let your system reset. And the fleet, carriers, CVs, the Essexes, these are the cycle engines. They carry the heavy strike groups and the deep maintenance shops and the planning rooms with grease pencils where kill chains are drawn and redrawn between sorties. They can take hits and keep command and air ops alive. But even an Essex is not a soloist here. It is a node. If an Essex's deck is fouled, the group keeps fighting because a CVL slides in to relieve, because a CVE on the periphery has spares for the afternoon go, because the oiler with her hose rigged like a church organ kept the whole line fueled in the night. So, what is to 100 carriers? It is a capability envelope, not a brag sheet. Americans built enough decks and trained enough crews and pipelined enough pilots that the total available flight decks, fleet, light and escort in theater at any given time stacked into 3 digits by the final campaigns. Some were on station, some were en route, some were in repair or training, some were handing over replacement aircraft like a traveling warehouse. To a Japanese pilot rolling inverted over Okinawa, it felt like this. Shoot down 2, 3, 5, and the sky does not empty. Kill a ship, and the task group flows around the hole as if the wound had a heartbeat and closed itself. This is why your competitors' scripts win when they keep returning to the mathematics of war, because to 100 is not a boastful number. It is an equation with terms like sortie rate, service life per engine, hours between deck scrubs, pilot throughput per month, average, replenishment window per task group. An equation that eats courage for breakfast and still asks for more inputs, fuel, ordnance, spare parts, fresh men. Japanese planning counted battles, American planning counted turns of the crank. The shock inside the Japanese Navy does not happen in one meeting. It accumulates. A night watch officer reads an intercept that suggests more fast carriers than last month. A yard superintendent at Cure notes the frequency of raids. A submarine commander observes convoys covered by air where there was none 2 months prior. A pilot notices that the cap overhead Okinawa seems to regenerate like a lizard's tail. Each fact lands as an anecdote. Together they reveal a different kind of war. The United States has built runways on assembly lines. If you need a metaphor that rings beyond numbers, close with this. Earlier in the war, the sea was an empty prairie broken by a few hard towns, the rare carrier groups. By 1945, the prairie has turned into a city grid in motion, blocks of decks, supply avenues, patrol alleys, intersections where a squadron turns left and a tanker turns right, and the city keeps breathing. That is what to 100 carriers means. Not 100 thrones, but 100 intersections in a living, moving metropolis of steel. Disbelief is a military resource. It saves morale in the short term. It buys a commander time to pretend a trend is weather. In late 1944, disbelief still served the Imperial Japanese Navy. The idea that the Americans could keep so many flight decks at sea for so long was considered narrative inflation, the boast of a clumsy giant. Until Leyte Gulf. Leyte is where the arithmetic began to shout. The Japanese plan assumed a lure and a trap. It also assumed that the replacement flow of American aircraft would lag, and that a flurry of attrition could open a window. Instead, after the first hard day, The next day looked the same. Then the next. And when the Japanese gambit bent American focus, the answer was not panic, it was reconfiguration. Task groups sliced and rejoined. Light carriers surged to pads where fleet carriers turned into hammers. Escort carriers stitched the seams with a needle made of Wildcats and Avengers. If you looked at the map, it seemed the same icons were merely rearranged. If you looked at the air, the effect was simpler. The Americans always had decks to launch from. Intelligence officers back in Tokyo leafed through reports and tried to normalize them. A reconnaissance note from a submarine. Multiple flatops sighted in series. Bearing knee. A pilot debrief. After engagement, enemy fighters returned in strength. A coastal observer's sketch. Arrows for bearings. Circles for estimated deck positions. Crowded circles where before there were one or two. At first, these were filed as local anomalies. Then the anomalies piled high enough to acquire a name. The Americans have more carriers than doctrine says is reasonable. But realization isn't born in a briefing room. It's born in a cockpit. A Japanese fighter pilot, call him Lieutenant S, climbs into thin blue over the Ryukyus, the kind of altitude where the world is quiet and the engine is a mantra. He expects that if he and his wingmen punch holes in one raid package, they'll buy the fleet a few hours of operational quiet. Instead, cutting through cloud, he catches another formation keying in at a different altitude band, the geometry of their approach suggesting a separate launch cycle. He dives, and the story repeats. Later, over sake in a drafty hangar, he tries to explain what is new. His hand draws not a single arrow but a ladder, waves at staggered heights, waves at staggered times. The word he reaches for is not numerous. It is continuous. Down in the yards, the ground truth is even uglier. Cure and Sasebo hear the sirens so often that the routines begin to feel normal. Men slide under girders, chalk marks hide under dust, sheet metal sighs into flame. A foreman who prides himself on meeting quotas watches them evaporate under the weight of raids that do not space themselves politely. You can work around a weekly beating. You cannot plan for an air city that commutes over your roof every day. If disbelief was a resource, it is now a liability. It prevents adaptation. And adaptation requires a different number. Fuel. Pilots trained fast. Planes pushed to line. Ships rushed from dock. None of it matters if you cannot put bunkers under the fleet and gasoline under the air. The intelligence summaries recognized this too late. They had recorded the American habit of oiling at sea as a curiosity. By the time the curiosity is read as doctrine, the runaway train of underway replenishment has already made the replenishment ship as decisive as any carrier. Realization is psychological collapse's sober cousin. Collapse can be sudden and noisy. Realization is quiet and cold. A naval staffer puts down a pencil and understands the ocean has been paved. A pilot, flying home on fumes, sees a fresh American cap arrive at dusk and knows that night will not spare him anymore, that there are night fighters now, and radar pickets, and a control net that grows as it fights. A destroyer captain watches medium bombers appear over a convoy route he had considered safe, and recalculates his odds of survival over coffee, not in prayer. The shock felt domestic too. Civilians at Cure described the sky as having shifts morning, midday, late afternoon like a factory. That metaphor is more precise than they knew. From those factory shifts, Japanese intelligence reconstructs numbers that hurt to read. Launch cycles imply flight deck count, recovery rhythms imply task group depth, and the appearance of fresh aircraft types late in a campaign implies spares injection from somewhere, escorts acting as flying warehouses. In memos, this becomes a complaint. Enemy possesses many bases. The bases are moving. Earlier in the war, some in Tokyo were bewitched by the idea of decisive battle, the chessboard moment where fleets converge and doctrine answers doctrine. By 1945, decisive battle is impossible, because decisiveness itself has been disassembled into a supply chain. Victory is achieved not by a sword thrust, but by the guarantee that the next thrust will be just as strong, and the next, until the opponent can no longer live between the blows. The Japanese naval mind, brilliant at tactics, brave to a fault, took too long to understand that the opponent wasn't arguing tactics. He was arguing capacity. At Okinawa, the last shields come up. Radar picket destroyers, thick flak, depth patrols, cap layers that look like a wedding cake. But the detail that kills more than any shield is the resilience of the schedule. Shot-down planes have replacements waiting. Bent decks yield their cycles to sisters. Escorts fill holes. Oilers are on rendezvous. The schedule survives contact. On the Japanese side, the schedule is the first thing to die. By the time staff officers can say aloud what everyone feels, the Americans effectively operate 100 launch sites. The war's decision has been rendered in the language of minutes and gallons and spare parts. No single briefing produces that sentence. It emerges, like a negative in a tray, from thousands of tiny exposures, radar screens, diary entries, shipyard logs, the ache in a pilot's shoulders after an afternoon where the enemy never ran out. The shock is not a scream. It's a sigh that says we are out of time. Nobody ever wrote a stirring poem about a punch press. They should have. Because if you want to understand why the Japanese looked up in 1945 and felt outnumbered by the horizon itself, start with a drafty American factory where the smell is oil and hot steel and coffee gone cold, and where a foreman's watch is more important than a mascot on a nose. Consider the Casablanca-class escort carriers, 50 of them built in what feels like a breath. They were not conceived as singular masterpieces. They were designed to be assembled. Blocks arrived by rail. Sections were welded in parallel. If a keel is a spine, a Casablanca's spine was cut into consistent vertebrae and snapped together with a rhythm you could dance to if you had the lungs. Every innovation here is a humble one. Standardization, jig-built sections, the kind of documentation that lets a new shift pick up the torch where the last left it. A runway is a runway. Once you realize you can pour one on a hull like a slab of concrete, the mystique vanishes and is replaced by cadence. The Essex-class carriers, the big CVs, weren't stamped out like Casablancas, but they rode the same philosophy: modular subassemblies, prefabrication, yard coordination that turned riverbanks and coasts into a distributed machine. The bow section in one place, the island in another, the engine room guts somewhere else, shipped and married and wired in a choreography that had less to do with naval romance and everything to do with industrial engineering. The question was never, can we build one? It was, how many parallel work streams can we run without tripping over ourselves? The answer, by 1944, was many. Here's the piece your competitor never quite nails. The manufacturing how ties directly to the operational why. A carrier is not a statue. It is a platform for cycles. If you build carriers in a way that assumes you will need spares, replacements and upgrades while the war is happening, you design not just for strength but for serviceability. That means standardized elevators and repeatable hangar layouts so ordnance crews can swap stations between ships without retraining. It means engine rooms you can reach without undressing the ship. It means wiring harnesses with documentation so a new warrant officer in the forward shop doesn't have to pray to the ghost of the original draftsman, all of which compresses downtime, which increases available sortie cycles, which when multiplied by dozens of decks translates into the sensation, on the receiving end, of an enemy that never runs dry. Run the deck math. A Casablanca can't fling a 100-plane strike, but 50 Casablancas can keep a theatre stitched together. Think of them as the seamstresses of the sea. They hem the convoys, darn the holes in ASW coverage, and put new patches on the fleet's jacket by delivering fresh aircraft and pilots. Their top speed is modest, but the assembly line didn't build them to race. It built them to be everywhere. With everywhere comes pressure. Japanese submarines, once emboldened by gaps, find an umbrella where there used to be rain. Now flip to the fast end. Essexes and Independents. Class CVLs. Here cadence becomes tempo. On a big deck, the difference between a 4-minute and a 5-minute spotting error compounds across a group and across a day until you've shed a full strike's worth of effect. American industry didn't just build decks, It built the repeatable processes that trained crews to run those decks like clockwork. Aircraft elevators sized for the planes actually used. Catapult gear maintained by sailors who trained on the exact same gear at stateside stations. Ordnance hoists that matched standard bomb shapes made in countless plants. If you think this is dull, ask a pilot whether he wants to hang in a pattern waiting for crews to sort out a bespoke ordnance issue while flak fattened below. He wants sameness. Sameness saves lives. The machine that feeds the machine sits behind the horizon. Oilers with hoses slung out like a cathedral's pipes. Ammunition ships packed to dangerous generosity. Repair ships with floating workshops and the kind of machinists who can listen to a pump and tell you its future. None of this is heroic in the storybook sense. All of it is heroic in the sense that it turns the largest ocean on Earth into a working plant. Night after night, UNREP doctrine makes the Pacific a graveyard shift. A replenishment group rendezvous in swells. Crews pass lines, and gallons and shells flow. In the morning, somewhere beyond sight of the men with guns aimed at them, the strike cycle resets with the serenity of a production schedule. From the Japanese vantage point, this reads as sorcery. How can the enemy shrug off losses, patch holes, and return with the same strength at noon as he had at dawn? There is no sorcery, there is inventory control. A warehouse manager in San Diego never sees a torpedo explosion off Okinawa, but his work turning parts lists into pallets, pallets into rail cars into holds, arrives as a fighter with a fresh engine, making a last light landing on a baby flat top. When your logistics chain owns the middle miles, your enemy experiences your front line as inevitable. It would be dishonest to pretend this factory never jammed. Weather, human error, enemy action, every line stutters. A fire on a hangar deck, a fouled cable, an oiler late to station. But the point of runways on assembly lines is not perfection, it is redundancy. A single jam no longer halts the symphony. Another oiler slides into slot. Another CVL takes half the afternoon cycle while a CV clears her deck. Another escort ferries the spare aircraft forward. In Japanese planning, the decisive engagement assumed one throat to choke. In American planning, there were 50. Psychologically, that is the kill shot. When men believe that breaking one thing will halt the beating, they fight differently. They gamble smart. When they learn that breaking one thing leads to another identical thing stepping up, the fight becomes an endurance test they did not train to pass. That is why the industrial chapter belongs in the script's emotional center. Factories do not look tragic on film, but they produce tragedy at scale for anyone who chooses to fight an industrialized opponent without being industrialized themselves. End this chapter with a truth that honors both sides. Japanese sailors fought with a courage that makes the throat tighten across the decades. Courage is a finite human resource. The American system learned how to multiply it with steel, with fuel, with training regimens and documentation and schedules. Japan tried to substitute for it when oil ran short, when pilots were scarce, when ships were too few by asking courage to do the work of factories. Courage cannot carry that load. The assembly line can. So yes, by the war's end, you can make an honest, sailor-centric claim that the United States effectively fielded around 100 carriers when you include the decks that actually mattered to men under bombs, big, light, and escort. But the number is only the surface. The depth is the method. Build the runway like a commodity. Teach crews to run it like a ritual. Feed it like a living thing, and then string so many together that the enemy experiences the sky as infrastructure. That was the American answer. And in 1945, the Japanese finally realized what that meant. The sky had been paved. The hardest thing to mass produce in war is not steel. It's competence. Steel arrives by the ton. Competence arrives one repetition at a time. Start with a room that feels almost monastic, a stateside ready room lined with silhouettes of enemy aircraft and the chalk dust of orbit patterns. A young man who used to deliver newspapers tries to memorize the difference between a Kate and a Val at 20 degrees off aspect. He can land a trainer on a runway that does not move. What he must learn now, because the system requires it, is to land on a postage stamp that pitches and heaves and smokes and shouts at him. The American answer to this problem isn't inspiration, it's curriculum. Ground school feeds primary, which feeds advanced, which feeds carrier qualification. Each step has a throughput number stamped on it like a crate. Flight hours per month, instructor ratios, washout rates, average time to wings. You can feel it in the language. Instructors don't talk about turning boys into men, they talk about syllabus completion. And the syllabi are standardized. A pilot trained in Texas can walk onto a Pacific deck and speak the same procedural dialect as a pilot trained in Florida. Standardization compresses time. Compressed time becomes more sorties, which becomes pressure you can feel all the way across an ocean. And while pilots are sexy in photographs, the carrier's beating heart is below the island, down where the air tastes like avgas and anodized metal. Ordnancemen work a choreography so complex it looks simple. Weapons out of the magazines via hoists, sized to the bomb dimensions stamped in factories 3 states away. Safety pins checked by muscle memory. Fuse settings tuned to mission profile. A Hellcat's wing pylon isn't just hardware. It's a promise that someone knows exactly how many turns of a wrench make tight into safe. When you see a photograph of a deck crew squatting under a wing with a bomb cradle, you are looking at the most honest unit of measure in the carrier war. A crew. Hour. How many crew hours does it take to produce a strike? Multiply across a task group. Multiply across a day. Add in the spotting, the fueling, the chocks and chains, the hand signals, the catapult hookups, the elevator cycles. Then add the LSO's landing signal officers, men with paddles, and later, lights, who are half priest, half traffic cop, judging closure rates and sink rates and wind lines in fractions of seconds. Their art looks like magic. It isn't. It's practice multiplied by procedural doctrine. Ask a pilot who survived a bad approach in rough seas whether charisma saved him or whether a system of calls and cut signals and hook checks did. He will point to the paddles and the procedure. Now consider the deck division itself. The colored shirts are not just wardrobe. They are a human interface that solves complexity with color-coded roles. Yellow for directors, blue for handlers, red for ordnance, purple for fuel, green for catapults and arresting gear, brown for plane captains, white for safety and medical. None of this is arbitrary. Color frees bandwidth. A glance sorts the chaos. It means a pilot taxiing through smoke finds his human landmarks faster, and a handler clearing a fouled deck wastes 0 syllables finding the right man. The pipeline to supply these men, and keep supplying them as injury and fatigue take their share, does not begin at sea. It begins in schools with names that sound boring on paper. A schools, B schools, gunnery schools, LSO schools. You could poke fun at their signage and fluorescent lights. You would be missing the point. They are the multipliers. They make one man's rule of thumb into a fleet's rulebook, and then they make the rulebook simple enough that it can be obeyed under noise and heat and fear, because fear is the 12th man on every deck. It manifests as tremor in a hand, a slight over-control in a crosswind, a second glance where there should be none. The American system treats fear as a variable to be mitigated by repetition. Carrier quals run until muscle memory humiliates fear into obedience. Emergency drills are not stern theatre. They are oxygen for survival. A flash fire drill isn't if, it's when. A crash crew learns to thread hoses under spinning props because the math says that somewhere, on some day, those props will still be turning while someone bleeds. You don't improvise a fix at that moment. You execute the checklist. Checklist is a homely word. It saves more lives than poetry. Catapult crews, hold, tension, fire, and then thumb a pencil across a board because the board prevents the one forgotten pin that ruins a day. Pilots do pre-flight with a hand on metal because a hand knows what a pencil cannot. The smell of a hot pump, the scrape of a hinge that should glide. The system marries the pencil and the hand. It treats both as sacred. The Japanese observed American pilots and wrote, sometimes bitterly, about their mediocrity. Translation: they mistook standardization for lack of flair. A mediocre pilot, in the Japanese lexicon, did not belong in a decisive duel. But the American fleet wasn't asking for poetry in the dueling circle. It was asking for reliable inputs to a machine. A mediocre pilot who could taxi, launch, form up, fight by tactic, and most crucially recover safely and do it again 4 hours later was not mediocre. He was perfect, because the costliest event in a cycle is not a fight lost. It is a plane lost in the pattern that fouls a deck and kills tempo. Tempo is everything. The human machine of the flight deck exists to manufacture tempo under hostile physics, wind, weight, fuel, flame. You can see it in the shuffle when spotting a mixed deck of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, nose to tail, wingtip to wingtip, engines chuffing at different beats, directors carving air with their arms as if conducting percussion. The fact that this kludge sings instead of screams is a miracle brought to you by training hours banked in calm water and burned in rough. Each man is replaceable, no man is trivial. That is the paradox. The pipeline must keep delivering hands familiar enough to be told once and act, but the deck must honor the craft those hands bring. In American practice, this becomes a culture: debrief everything. The LSO critiques even a good landing. The ordnance chief barks about a slow fuse setting that shaved seconds off a cycle. The air boss rehearses tomorrow's launch at tonight's debrief so that the deck wakes up knowing what the day owes. This is not obsession for its own sake. It is an investment that pays out in sortie rate. And sortie rate, across a task force, is a felt experience on an enemy ship. It is the difference between one strike to be endured and a process to survive. When Japanese diaries talk about the sky that never empties, they are paying involuntary tribute to American training schedules, debrief cultures, checklists, color codes, and the quiet tyranny of competence at scale. The boy who learned to tell a vowel from a Kate now knows in his bones what the right answer is to almost every deck problem. He answers not with inspiration but with procedure executed at speed. In that, monotony lives victory. You can build the finest flight deck in the world and turn it into a dead museum in 3 days if you cannot feed it. The system that truly paved the Pacific wasn't just steel on the surface. It was liquid in the veins. Picture an oiler easing into station at night. The sea is black glass cut by white seams. Red lights blink in ritual lines. Voices are low because low voices enforce calm, and calm prevents metal from kissing metal in the wrong way. The carrier and the oiler dance closer until they are absurdly intimate. Lines are thrown. Then hoses snake out, heavy as sins, and are caught by men whose palms have learned that a late grab costs knuckles. The hose clamps on, pumps whine. The deck under your boots begins to hum. This is unrep underway, replenishment the doctrine that unhooks a fleet from geography. Historically, fleets planned around ports the way farmers plan around rains. Unrep changed the calendar. It turned steaming days, the days a task force could remain on station, fueled and fed into a function of choreography rather than map pins. Want to launch dawn strikes tomorrow? Then tonight you rendezvous off a line you named last week, and the oilers take their place in the queue, and the ammunition ships do too, and a floating motor pool's worth of spare props, engines, control surfaces, and tires gets pushed across steel gaps by human chains that truly deserve the word heroic. Fuel is the loudest need. Ammunition is the least forgiving. A bomb you do not have cannot be improvised by courage. The same doctrine that runs hoses runs hoists. Ammunition ships creep into station, guarded like a monarch and sweating like a sinner, and the transfer begins. Slings rise, pallets cross, powder cans thump onto the deck with a respect bordering on fear, fuses sorted, bomb bodies counted in a language of inventory codes that tie back to factories where someone's pen made a column add to 0. In that 0 hides the certainty that an afternoon strike will go as planned instead of going as a rumor. How much fuel does a fast carrier task force gulp in a day? Enough that the numbers begin to float free of everyday life, Think in tens of thousands of barrels moving across hoses that flex and sigh under wave slaps. Think of the way a combat air patrol alone, just the fighters guarding the big decks, drinks a small lake dry in a few days. Then add the strike packages, the search flights, the ASW patrols, the plane guard destroyers. Every minute a hose stays connected buys a handful of tomorrows. The algebra is brutal but clean. If a task force burns X per day, and the Oilers can deliver Y per rendezvous, then the difference between operational presence and forced withdrawal collapses to scheduling. Scheduling, in turn, collapses to risk. Can you bring your logistics tail close enough, often enough, without letting an enemy carve it open? If the answer is yes, because you have escorts enough to build a moving sanctuary, because your air cover can swat at scouts, because your anti-subnets are tight, then your steaming days approach infinity relative to your opponents. Infinity, at scale, looks to the enemy like despair. Fuel and ammo are only the start. Unrep's genius is its promiscuity. Spare engines travel just like pork chops and mail. A plane with a tired power plant does not become a sad, cannibalized skeleton. It becomes a temporary patient. An engine comes across in a sling, cradled like a vial, and goes below to a shop where a petty officer with forearms like cables listens, then turns a wrench, then signs a line. The patient rolls out with a new heart. You can measure compassion in war by triage tents. You can measure American ruthlessness in procedures by how fast a wounded airplane returns to the line. The hoses and lines carry something softer but decisive too: time. Every hour saved in transfer is an hour kept in the bank against weather and error. The doctrine is built to hoard minutes as if they were bullion. A replenishment group staggers arrivals so that the task force never waits for everything to happen at once. Damage control drills aboard logistics. Ships are rehearsed with the same stern energy as aboard combatants, because a single fire in a hold full of high explosive can erase months of production. The sleepy name for this is risk management. The real name is keeping tomorrow alive. Japanese officers who witnessed this at a distance, sighting Oilers in formation where there should have been combatants alone, felt the boundary between front line and rear evaporate. Their doctrine could not keep carriers fueled and rearmed at this rate. Port-to-port logistics meant periodicity. Either you fight or you refit. The American doctrine meant continuity. You fight while you feed. The difference is visible in operational maps. The American footprint looks like coverage. The Japanese footprint looks like punctuation. There is a psychological dividend paid in mailbags and ice cream. It sounds trivial. It isn't. A carrier that can pass fuel and bombs can also pass news from home, fresh film for the photo lab, medical supplies, and the small luxuries that turn a steel city into a place where men can endure. Morale is not a poster on a bulkhead. It is the difference between a crew that swaps a pump in the rain with a joke and a crew that does it with a curse. The hose delivers spirit along with fuel. Unrep is not magic. It is a knife's edge discipline. Seas roll. Lines snap. Miscommunication scrapes paint and egos. A hose that parts at pressure becomes a python. Every evolution is a bet that you will execute the procedure precisely enough to avoid being the reason someone writes a grim letter. The bet pays out because the system trains for the worst on boring Tuesdays so that the spectacular Thursdays look inevitable. The measure of the system's maturity is found in an officer's tone at 0300 on a darkened bridge. Casual, almost bored, as distances close to yards at speed. Casual didn't come cheap. It was bought by doctrine, and the doctrine was bought by experience turned into procedure, turned into habit. When a Japanese sailor peers through binoculars and sees masts where he knows in his bones there must be Oilers, he understands something essential. The Americans are not topping off. They are growing roots in the ocean. Roots feed leaves. Leaves make shade. By 1945, the shade covers entire campaigns. In that cool, the American carrier ecosystem photosynthesizes victory from gallons and checklists and the unglamorous bravery of men who hold hoses steady while the Pacific tries to jerk them free. The Essex-class carrier is a study in decisions that look modest on paper and ruthless in practice. To understand why it worked, why it was the right tool for an industrial war, you have to set aside the romance of ironclads and think like a factory foreman with a stopwatch. Start with the flight deck, wood over steel. Critics loved to argue about it then, and still do now. Wooden decks char, gouge, and burn, but they patch fast. In a war where the decisive metric is available launch surface per hour, the ability to chainsaw a wounded square out, drop in a plug, and sand it flat before the afternoon cycle is not a footnote. It's survival. An armoured deck might resist the initial wound better. A wooden deck lets the ship return to productive rhythm faster. In manufacturing, you would call that a design optimized for maintainability. Elevator placement is another reveal. The Essex put big elevators where they fed the flow from hangar to deck in a geometry that minimized taxi distance and avoided fouling the catapults. You could draft a white paper on this, or you could watch a launch cycle from the island. The proof is in the motion. Planes rise, roll, hook up, and go without crossing flight paths that multiply risk. Out of sight, below, shops and stores are arranged so that spare parts move forward into the fight instead of sideways into confusion. A good deck plan is a hymn to friction reduction. The island itself, bridge, flag, plot, radars, is proportioned for command that doesn't get in the way of operations. Flag plots that swallow staff, but don't swallow attention. Windows placed for sightlines to the deck community. The air boss's pulpit becomes a pulpit precisely because it lets him see flow. He calls, holds, and goes like a conductor, adjusting tempo. All of this is architecture serving throughput. Armament? Adequate and evolving. You can count gun tubs and argue calibers, but the critical improvement sits in the circuitry. Radar, directed fire, better fuses, tighter director integration. Guns serve the deck, not the other way around. The carrier is a factory making sorties. The guns are its perimeter security system. If a design decision increased sortie count at the cost of a few gun positions, American practice tended to make that trade, not because they were careless, but because they recognized the factory's product and refused to be sentimental about ornament. Crew spaces tell a similar story. The Essex was big enough to house the specialists. A cycle demands metal smiths, electricians, ordnance techs, engine men, cooks who could feed a small town between launches. That space is not a luxury. It is elasticity, the ability to absorb casualties and keep running. The room to train replacement hands while at sea. The elbow room to set up an emergency shop when a particular system won't wait for the next tender. Capacity in steel converts into resilience in schedule. And then there is the air group. Essex-class carriers carried enough airplanes to matter and enough fuel and ordnance to keep them mattering. They could mix fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, then shuffle the proportions across a campaign. The air group became a toolbox, not a sculpture. If the day called for a fighter-heavy cap because a kamikaze wave was expected, the deck could be respotted accordingly. If the afternoon called for deep strike, the ordnance train could pivot to bomb bodies, and the deck crew could stack them like canned goods. The design enabled doctrine agility. Compare this to a ship optimized for a peacetime parade. Shiny fittings, unique solutions that look elegant but make spare parts a scavenger hunt. Essex avoided this trap by having siblings. Siblings share. They share parts, procedures, and lessons learned. When Essex-3 suffers a fire under the forward elevator and the fix requires a new baffle arrangement, Essex-7 gets the baffle before she faces the same hazard in anger. Design plus numbers equals an ecosystem where the fleet learns faster than the enemy adapts. What about survivability? The class took punishment and lived, not because it was magic, but because damage control was a design goal and a cultural obsession. Watertight integrity, redundant runs for critical systems, distributed firefighting stations, and the training to make them count. A ship that absorbs a bomb and keeps flight ops within hours is not a miracle. It is what you get when your ship is laid out, so that the water wants to stay where you put it. The fire wants to find nowhere to breathe, and the people know their routes and roles in darkness and smoke. Cycle time wins wars measured in sorties, not in highlight reels. The Essex class treated every deck decision as a lever on cycle time. Spotting patterns? A lever. Elevator size? A lever. Arresting gear maintenance philosophy? A lever. Even the position of the coffee urn in the ready room is a lever, if it gets pilots into their brief 5 minutes sooner and relaxed 2 beats deeper. Laugh at that if you like. Then imagine multiplying 5 minutes by 200 airplanes across a task force. Imagine those minutes accumulating into an extra late strike that cuts an enemy runway before dawn. Now laugh. Japan built beautiful ships. Some were faster. Some carried heavier armor. Beauty and armor are not wrong. They are simply insufficient if the opponent is optimizing for sustained output. The Essex class is the steel embodiment of a management principle: maximize value flow. It is Toyota on saltwater before Toyota was a household word. Waste is the enemy. Wasted movement, wasted time, wasted courage. The Essex cuts it wherever it finds it and turns the savings into pressure. Pressure wins. Close with this. Standing on an Essex deck at dusk, with the last recoveries whispering onto the wires, the island lights hooded and soft. You hear the ship breathe. Fans thrumming below, pumps talking to pipes, cooks chopping, typists clacking in flag plot, each a small sound in a big machine. The machine's purpose is not to look invincible. It is to make tomorrow's flight schedule certain. In that certainty lies the kind of power that breaks enemies not in a charge, but in accumulation. Call it TF-58 when the Navy runs the show, TF-38 when the aviators do. In either case, it is the most dangerous idea of the war, a task force designed as a self-healing process. The doctrine lives on grease pencil boards, and in the habit words men use when they barely have time to breathe. Cycle, push, rejoin, cap layer, pickets, vector. It begins with the simplest, most audacious premise: not a single carrier, but groups of carriers operating as mutually supporting cells. Each group can cover another's recovery, absorb shocks, and use its CVLs like knives to cut where a heavier sword would be slow. Every carrier is a launch pad. Every launch pad is backed by at least one more. Cyclic operations turn days into metronomes. Launch, strike, recover, refuel, rearm, relaunch on a clock tight enough that the after-action report reads like the time card of a factory shift. The air plan sets altitudes, routes, and pushes with an engineer's cruelty. There is artistry, composition of strikes, choice of ingress, but the engine beneath is scheduling. 2 carriers stagger their cycles so one's recovery window coincides with the other's launch. Fighters peel off to thicken cap just as bombers roll outbound. A CVL holds the ready deck to catch stragglers or to throw a fast intercept if a leak in the radar net oozes trouble. The effect is not chaos, it is resilience. Then stack the cap, high, mid, low. Above them, early warning airborne or by radar pickets feeds vectors. Below them, destroyers and cruisers lay down flak that ranges from polite to apocalyptic. Unseen, a net of submarines hunts the enemy's approach lanes. Out on the rim, picket destroyers take a beating that buys warning minutes. A radar blip becomes a plot becomes a vector call. A vector becomes fighters sliding down the correct line in the sky to meet intruders where it hurts them most before they organize. Doctrine here is simple, almost cruel. Don't fight fair, fight early. The fighter director sits in a small space filled with taps, scopes, and voices. He is the pivot of a national investment. The set under his hand hums with power made in dams and shipped as copper. The antenna above him was drilled by a machinist who never saw the ocean. The pilot in his ear is the product of 1,000 instructors' patience. The director's job is not glorious. It is probabilistic. Given a bearing and speed, allocate fighter sections to kill the most inbound before they find a dive path. The mathematics of intercept geometry, climb rates, closure speeds, fuel states flows through his head. He is triage for the sky. Done right, he makes heroics scarce and survivors plentiful. Task force doctrine is merciless to dwell time. No plane loiters without purpose. If a fighter has fuel to give, it gives it where it buys risk reduction on a cap leg that covers a recovery, on a sweep leg that clears the next push's path. If a bomber is late, the cycle flexes but does not warp. Pilots are taught that the schedule is Zoffer. That sounds bureaucratic until you realize the schedule is what keeps you alive, the guaranteed cap on return, the expected tanker, the launch time, that means you won't meet dusk in the wrong quadrant of the sky. Individual freedom yields to the network's needs, and the network pays back in certainty. Strike composition reflects the system's intolerance for single-point failure. Fighters ride shotgun, escorts ride the escorts. Bombers split into elements whose ingress routes and altitudes knit together an attack that is hard to parry with a single tactic. If the enemy stacks to swat the dive bombers, the torpedo planes breathe. If the enemy spreads to catch the torpedo planes, the dive bombers rake. If weather pushes one element wide, the doctrinal plan already allows for a secondary target with coordinates memorized and ordnance fusing set accordingly. The goal is not the best attack, but a guaranteed attack. At night, the system grows a second face. Night fighters prowl, guided by radar and voices that feel like fingers on their shoulders. Task groups dim to firefly pricks, and the enemy learns that darkness is no longer a sanctuary, but a hunting preserve with rules he did not write. Picket ships extend the net, paying an awful rent in casualties, and in that rented time the fighters find shadows and erase them. The Pacific no longer sleeps. ASW, the anti-submarine screen, does its work in humiliation. Submariners, once wolves, become rats chased from drains. Escorts and CVEs seed the ocean with patrol patterns that intersect because math says they should. Sonar sings, depth charges thump, and the absence of sinkings becomes the most eloquent statistic in the war. The air umbrella and the surface net cooperate not by accident but by plan, and the plan is updated every night in a ritual of debriefs where lessons learned today become standing orders tomorrow. This engine of doctrine has an emotional center, the brief and the debrief. In the trimond, morning, a strike leader stands under a map and turns anxiety into assignments who leads what division, at what minute, on what heading, with what fuse setting. In the evening he stands again and turns results into improvements. Ego is sanded away by the need to be better tomorrow. The task force's memory is not in a single head. It is in procedures that thicken as the campaign lengthens. That is how an institution learns faster than individuals forget. The Japanese Navy, brilliant at decisive battle logic, kept looking for the moment to meet the enemy's main body and trade masterpieces. The fast carrier task force denied the premise. It refused to concentrate its value in a single unit that could be trapped. It concentrated effects instead, effects delivered by many decks, staged across time and space, defended by layers. Decisive battle did occur, but not in the shape expected. It occurred as attritional certainty imposed on an opponent who ran out of ways to interrupt the schedule. You can watch the doctrine's triumph in small scenes. A pilot diverts to a CVL because his assigned deck is fouled. Nobody panics. The alternate deck catches him, refuels him, and he is back in the plan. A destroyer on the ring calls out a raid. The vector goes. Fighters roll. The recovery is delayed by 4 minutes. The air boss flexes the order of landings. Nobody dies for a timing error. The machine absorbs error the way a living body absorbs cuts, with clotting, with rerouting, with redundancy engineered in. What makes this better than your competitors' take is the insistence on the boring words, not just thunder process, not just glory governance. Doctrine is governance for violence. And in the Pacific, the Americans wrote a constitution for the sky. Who speaks, when, who turns, where, who waits, why. That constitution does not produce heroes by design, though it tolerates them. It produces outcomes. And by 1945, the outcome was this: a Japanese officer staring at a wave plot and realizing he could no longer guess where the next deck was. because the answer had become everywhere enough. The Fast Carrier Task Force is a system because it behaves like one under insult. You can hurt it. You can bloody it badly. You cannot make it stop unless you take away the inputs: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, trained men, or the rulebook itself. The Japanese tried for the inputs with submarines and aircraft. The American logistics net held. They tried for the rulebook with shock kamikaze as a doctrinal wrench thrown into the gears. The task force bled and then rewrote the procedures in real time. Thicker cap over pickets, better vectoring, improved firefighting, more armored hose runs, adjusted recovery patterns. The system adapted at the speed of its debrief cycle. That speed was faster than a nation on short rations could match. In the end, doctrine is empathy for the future. You write rules today that will save men you haven't met yet tomorrow. TF 58/38 lived that empathy. It made the next launch inevitable. It made the enemy's hope for a pause delusional. And to sailors watching their world constrict under a sky that behaved like a city on rails, that inevitability felt like the true shape of American power. Not loud, not even fast, but relentless, scheduled, and everywhere. In a duel, attrition feels like tragedy. In an industrial war, attrition is bookkeeping. The Fast Carrier Task Force doesn't deny loss, it prices it. Every pilot who doesn't come back is a man, a story, a hole at a mess table. The system honors that and then moves the numbers that must move to keep pressure constant. Aircraft, engines, aircrew, deck gear, even the odd catapult cylinder whose seals are tired after a brutal month. Picture a late afternoon aboard a CVE riding the swells behind the main groups. Her nickname is Humble, her mission is not. On her deck, a line of brand new Hellcats sits with protective paper still taped over gun ports. Each is tagged to a squadron that lost too many wings this week. An hour after the big decks recover their last strike, the jeep carrier turns into a flying warehouse, aircraft craned, towed, taxied, and ferried forward in a relay that looks unglamorous until you overlay it on the enemy's psychology. What the foe expects. We bled them. They will rest. Never arrives. Instead, the Americans manifest as constant temperature. Hot in the morning, hot at noon, hot at dusk. The arithmetic hides in the calendar. Pilot schools graduate on a rhythm. Replacement drafts ship on a rhythm. Factory lines release engines and propellers on a rhythm. Convoys and replenishment groups beat to a schedule that is boring in its reliability. War is the attempt to interrupt an enemy's rhythm. By 1945, interruption is exactly what the Japanese can no longer achieve. They can shock. They can hurt. They cannot sustain hurt at a rate that outpaces American replacement flow. Mechanically, this shows up as availability. If you need 70% of your air group on the line to make the day's plan work, and you start the day at 90, you can lose 10 planes and still meet your plan, provided those 10 have replacements inbound. The replacements need not arrive that hour. They must arrive before the tempo assumptions break. The Americans design for this slack. Spare engines stored where they can be swapped at sea, propellers on cradles labeled by pitch and hub, wing panels jig, ready for fast change-outs. Even a brash fighter ace is, in system terms, a component with a replacement curve defined by training throughput. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Ruthlessly. Attrition's other face is maintenance, the quiet killer. Engines that run hard at sea hate salt and repetition. Arresting gear hates success. Each trap pays for itself in wear. The system fights physics with check cycles that feel neurotic until you watch them prevent catastrophe. Lubrication schedules posted like liturgy, non-destructive. Inspections that find cracks before cracks become headlines. Spare parts discipline that refuses to let today's emergency become tomorrow's grounding. A carrier with a full magazine and an empty storeroom of small parts is a tourist. The Americans make sure that never happens. Now put yourself on the enemy's bridge. You plan for a window, 2 days of weather, a stretch of overcast, a run of night sorties, and you get hits. The next morning you face the same mass. Not the same ships perhaps, but the same effect. This is the moment morale changes shape. When loss does not purchase time, loss begins to feel meaningless, and meaning is the fuel courage burns. The Japanese Navy commanded vast courage. The American replacement system devalued the currency. The calculus is not bloodless. Men do not stand at rails and talk throughput. They stand at rails and count friends missing at muster. But the silent triumph of the system is that it turns grief into preserved tempo. A squadron bereft is rotated back. Another slides into its slot. The flight schedule flexes by minutes, not days. The machine does not harden its heart. It multiplies its will. Here is the stark contrast. Japan's training pipeline, hammered by fuel scarcity, bombed airfields, and compressed timelines, cannot keep pace with the loss function. Unit quality drifts downward exactly when the battles grow fiercest. The United States, aching but fed, keeps skills flat or rising. Over time, attrition ceases to be a slope, both sides slide down. It becomes a ramp, one side ascends while the other stumbles. That is not fate, it is management. The lesson is impolite and true. In a war of cycles, survivors are manufactured, not by cynicism, but by logistics that make sure a pilot returning at dusk sees the tanker where the plan promised, the LSO at the cut light he trained to obey, the maintenance crew with the part the checklist said would wear. Multiply that by the count of decks the enemy sees when he looks up and loses the ability to count. Attrition ceases to be a path to victory. It becomes the slope of defeat. Japan answered with brilliance where it could, and desperation where it had to. The Taiho, armoured, modern, menacing, embodied the belief that a single better ship could anchor a renewed, decisive battle. The conversion of Shinano into a carrier from a super battleship hull showed audacity. The Unryu class promised numbers. Each plan collided not with American heroics but with American conditions. Fuel first. A carrier is a promise it can't keep without aviation gasoline and the escorts to shepherd its tankers. As the Empire's oil lifelines frayed, training hours shrank. A pilot without practice is a sculpture of intent. Japan could still produce talented individuals. It could no longer standardize competence across units. Meanwhile, American UNREP made fuel a rhythm, not a hope. The difference expressed itself in patterns. US task groups loitered in strength. Japanese groups sprinted, then starved. Aircrew second. The early war cadre exceptional, experienced bled away faster than replacements could be seasoned. Under pressure, training compressed from mastery to sufficiency. Syllabi trimmed. Graduates flew with fewer hours. Combat became classroom. Across the line, US training stayed long enough to burn habit into bones. In dogfights and in shipboard recoveries, habit wins more days than genius. Industry third. Shipyard capacity bent under bombing and supply shocks. The elegant ships still launched, the mediocre ones still mattered, but both arrived into a battle space where American quantity with quality rolled like weather. A single masterpiece cannot interrupt a storm front. Doctrine last. The turn to kamikaze was not madness, it was logic under scarcity. If you cannot beat the schedule, create shocks large enough to tear holes in it. And kamikaze hurt pickets bled, decks burned, crews watched fire eat paint and lungs. But shock is a blade, tactic, not a logistics system. The Americans adapted. Thicker cap, better fighter direction, more armored hose runs, hardening of critical flight deck routines, rapid firefighting doctrine, improved medical response. Scarcity weaponized courage, abundance weaponized learning. Where did Japanese attempts succeed? In moments. A carrier crippled here, a destroyer mortally wounded there, a nerve slit at a radar picket station that paid for minutes with lives. Moments do not rewire campaigns unless backed by a repeatable engine. Japan's engine coughed. Not enough fuel to train widely, not enough pilots to refresh deeply, not enough factories to outpace American replacement rates, not enough escorts to keep oilers safe routinely, not enough radios, scopes, and procedural glue to bind a fleet into a system. Psychology sealed it. Scarcity creates romance, the last charge, the heroic sacrifice. the elite unit. Romance has tactical bite. It cannot substitute for the mundane miracle of tomorrow. The American machine made tomorrow likely. The Japanese courage made today unforgettable. Wars measured in months reward the former, not the latter. Point to the pylons of failure, a fuel plan that could not support doctrine, a training pipeline that could not protect experience, a shipbuilding program that could not produce redundancy, a command culture that treasured decisive battle while the enemy dissolved decisiveness into process. None of these negate Japanese bravery. They explain why bravery moved the needle less with each passing season. In the end, the countermoves read like exquisite answers to yesterday's test. The Americans had already changed the questions. Can you keep decks at sea indefinitely? Can you replace losses faster than they matter? Can you learn faster than you bleed? If your doctrine cannot say yes 3 times, you are writing poetry against a spreadsheet. The shock is not confined to bridges and ready rooms. It walks home. In Kure, smoke curls. From shipyard chimneys at dawn and from bombed timbers by noon. A clerk who has never seen the open sea learns the timetable of raids the way a farmer once learned the time of rains. Morning shift, she writes in a letter, about planes. At Yokosuka, a family breaks for the shelters with muscle memory. Children can sketch silhouettes with unsettling accuracy. The father, once an ironworker, hates that skill and is proud of it in the same breath. When he returns to his bench, he finds the same problem waiting, a rivet supply delayed, a jig warped, a foreman counting steel like beans because the line above him cannot promise tomorrow's tonnage. Overhead, American decks keep their appointments. Sailors feel the shock in their sleep cycles. A destroyer crewman on radar picket duty watches his scope flicker with contacts at ranges that would once have meant one raid. Now it means layers. Fighters at cap, strike packages queuing, patrol planes returning to their mother's decks. Another group already vectoring to replace the cap that burns fuel at the speed of a heartbeat. He does not know the names of the carriers. He knows the rhythm. He marks it the way a man marks his own pulse. Habit that proves he is alive, and ironically proves the enemy is unstoppable. Air raid wardens on the home islands learn to read the rest between strikes and discover that rest is shorter this month than last. Factories adapt with drills that assume the next wave will arrive on the quarter hour. The idea that the sea is far collapses. The sea is now a factory across the horizon. Its conveyor belt runs in both directions. Airplanes out, wounded back, and a line of oilers and ammunition ships plodding along under a canopy of fighters, invisible to civilians, but real in the way that nothing runs out. Morale does not crack like glass. It delaminates. An engineer knows his math. His math says the ship under scaffolds will not launch on time. His math says it wouldn't matter even if it did. The enemy's pace would swallow it. He does his shift anyway. He is not a coward, not a traitor. He is a man who understands that effort can be honorable and insufficient at once. Listen to a pilot on leave. He tells a friend that the strangest thing about the Americans is not their machines, it is their predictability. We rose to meet them, he says, and another group appeared as if the first had been a rehearsal. The friend asks if he means there are so many. He shakes his head. So regular. The word is a verdict. In the shelters, a grandmother remembers the Russo, Japanese War, and the romance of fleets steaming to meet like chess pieces. She cannot reconcile that story with the noise above her, now a ferry schedule of violence. She asks if there will be an end to the day. Her daughter says yes, because mothers lie kindly. Outside, the schedule holds. The shock matters because it breaks narrative. People can endure if their story says suffering purchases victory. The Japanese story, courage, skill, decisive battle paid out early. By 1945, it defaults. The American story systems, schedules, redundancy pays interest that compounds. When civilians speak of endless carriers, they are not reciting statistics, they are translating felt tempo into words. War ends on paper, it ends in hearts earlier. The paper says, surrender. The hearts gave up something vital when they realized the enemy's sky was a city, and the city had a transit map, and that no single raid, no single masterstroke, no single sacrifice could knock the power out. Shock, then resignation, then a quiet courage that shifts from "we will win" to "we will live." The last is not a failure. It is what people do when the sky becomes infrastructure and the clock belongs to someone else. Count the decks at war's end, not as trophies but as evidence. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers enough that a sailor peering from a shattered pier believed the horizon had learned to multiply. Then watch what happens next. Demobilization. Ships mothballed in silent rows, decks bare, catwalks haunted by seagulls. Men go home. Tools cool. The factory idles. But the lesson doesn't idle. It walks forward into the age of the supercarrier and the jet. The war did not argue that one giant ship is a talisman. It argued that systems beat singularities. The post-war Navy keeps the rhythm. Training pipelines, replenishment doctrine, standardization that greases handoffs between units, a culture of debrief and procedure that treats heroism as a last resort, not a plan. The steel gets bigger, the truth stays small and sharp. Cycle time wins. For Japan, the lesson is equally hard and equally durable. Courage is priceless and non-scalable. Industry is prosaic and scalable. If you must fight an industrial nation, do not fight the part that writes poems. Fight the part that writes schedules. Break its inputs, confound its timing, make its governance wobble. If you cannot do those things, you are arguing with a metronome. The metronome will not hear you. Honor the men. Across both navies, men held hoses against living seas, caught wires with shaking hands, dove through flak, dragged their shipmates out of fire, and looked up at skies thick with machines that turned their courage into fate. They did not choose the economics of their war. They met it. The coder must make room for that honor, without lying about cause and effect. Systems decided. Return to the boy on the destroyer's bow, in Chapter 1. The smoke has thinned, the sea is stippled with wreckage, and the small, terrible beauties of war rafts, crates, oil rainbows, a shoe. If you stood next to him then and told him the future, he would not pass fuel rates or sortie curves. He would understand a simpler sentence. They had more places to take off from than we had ways to make them stop. That is the whole book in a line. The sky became a harbour. The harbour filled with runways. The runways were fed by hoses and habits. The habits were guarded by doctrine. The doctrine was written to turn minutes into blows and blows into certainty. At the end, a nation looked up and realized it was not facing ships. It was facing a schedule. Dim the lights on the flight deck. The chalkboards are wiped. The last debrief ends. Somewhere, a petty officer locks a storeroom with the small pride of things counted and safe. The war is done. The math remains, waiting for anyone who would forget.